On this episode of Newt's World, the 2024 presidential election was an election the American people dreaded, a rematch between the two oldest men to ever serve as president. But somewhere along the way, the battle for the White House became the most jaw-dropping, heart-pounding, head-turning contest in American history. The ride was so wild that it forced a sitting president to drop his reelection bid, a once and future president to survive felony convictions and a would-be assassin's bullet, and a vice president unexpectedly thrown into the arena to mount an unprecedented 107-day campaign to lead the free world. And that's why I was very excited that in their new book, Fight, Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House, best-selling authors Jonathan Allen and Amie Parnes provide the first graphic view of the characters, their motivations, and their innermost thoughts as they battled to claim the ultimate prize and define a political era. Based on real-time interviews with more than 150 insiders from the Trump, Harris, and Biden inner circles, as well as party leaders and operatives, Fight delivers the vivid and stunning tale of an election unlike any other. Here to discuss their book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guests, Jonathan Allen, an award-winning political reporter at NBC News, and Amie Parnes, a senior political correspondent covering national politics at The Hill. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to be with you.
First of all, I want to congratulate you as an author myself. The fact that Fight is number 2 in the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list this week, it's a great achievement for a book which I think by word of mouth is just going to continue to sell. I'm curious, when did you two come up with the concept of doing this book?
This is our third campaign book, and we weren't even going to do it until our publisher asked us on the heels of Biden's disastrous debate last June if we would jump in. And so, of course, we were pulled in, and we knew that it was going to be an incredible election cycle, but we could never have predicted the twists and turns that this race would take.
When you talked about that debate, and you write that, quote, Biden altered the course of the 2024 election in a profound and permanent manner. Did the debate surprise you?
It did, Mr. Speaker. And here's the reason. It's not that Amie or I thought that Joe Biden was the Joe Biden of the vice presidency or his days in the Senate. We wrote a book about the 2020 election called Lucky that delved into the strange situation where Biden was able to be hidden because of the pandemic, basically hidden from the voters for most of that election. We knew that he had, even at that point, lost something off his fastball. And I think we all saw that there was decline. But still, it is shocking. I'm trying to think of a better word for it, but just utterly shocking to see the leader of the free world so bereft of coherent thought. I mean, there should never be a minute period or a 5-minute period where the president of the United States is in the kind of fog that Joe Biden was in that night. And the way that we put it in the book, and sources have put it to us, is you can't unsee that. You can't see the person with all the power to defend us with his finger on the nuclear button, just incapable of cogency. And so it was shocking on that level. The degree to which and the profundity of the decline, I think, was shocking.
You report that his total debate prep was one 45-minute round. First of all, I'm not quite sure why they wanted this early debate. You might be able to shed some light on that. But if you're going to do an early debate as the incumbent, it would seem to me you would block in a week to just totally focus, and they get 45 minutes?
Yeah, well, I think, Mr. Speaker, they wanted to change the trajectory of the race. They needed a reset. They were looking at their internal polling, and it was showing that the former president was winning. And so I think his team got together and thought that they needed to do something to change the direction. And so they landed on this debate thinking that it would be a reset of sorts. And little did they know it would pull them in the other direction, and it would lead to the president withdrawing from the race. They tried to do various debate sessions with him, but he was in the middle of a cold. We describe this in great detail in the book, but he had a sore throat and he was coughing and sneezing, and they tried to work with him. We asked, why wouldn't you cancel the debate? And they thought that that would be even worse. It would signal to people that, he was weak and couldn't debate while he was sick. And so they were in a no-win situation.
Do you think, in retrospect, they would have been better off to cancel?
That's a good question. I think if they thought they could reschedule it quickly, then maybe it would have been better to cancel. But the truth is, maybe those were the worst 5 minutes or 10 minutes of Joe Biden's life, but my guess is that they weren't. And at some point, the American public was either going to decide that he was hiding too much, or they were going to see him like that. And if it had happened in September or October, they wouldn't have had an opportunity to make a change. Obviously, President Trump wins despite having had to beat both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I think what Harris provided the Democrats was somebody they could rally around to minimize the number of defeats they had in House and Senate races.
Do you think if Biden had stayed in, that he would have lost by a bigger margin than Harris did?
I think definitely. He seems to think that he would have won. He has said as much, but all evidence points to the fact that she probably performed better than he would have.
As you talked with people, what was the sense you got that there wasn't more honest reporting about just how deeply he had declined?
I think it's an unfair criticism, to be honest, Mr. Speaker, because I know I can speak for myself and John in that we not only reported that his mental acuity and his age in our respective news outlets, but we also wrote about it in our previous book, Lucky. We always kind of knew about this, but we do have new revelations in the book which shed new light on how much President Biden was losing, as John says, his fastball, how he comes face to face with a Congressman, Eric Swalwell, at a congressional picnic at the White House, and he doesn't recognize him. He needs to be cued by Swalwell about who he is. This is a guy who he competed against in 2020 and shared a debate stage with. And there are other moments. He needed fluorescent tape at a fundraiser's house to guide him from place to place. That's more common in rallies and bigger rallies, not as much in someone's home. A teleprompter as well at someone's home. And we go on and on. He needs a makeup artist when he travels. That's sort of the first order of business that he does when he's traveling. He meets with a makeup artist ahead of meetings, Zoom meetings with his own staff. And so there's revelation after revelation about all of this in the book.
And Mr. Speaker, I would just add to that, I wouldn't make the argument that the media broadly covered itself in glory with the coverage of Biden's decline, but there are certain limitations. The White House was keeping him in such a cocoon that even mid to high level White House staffers didn't see him very often. When you're in the media, if you're an objective journalist, you can't go on television or write in a story that the guy's got dementia or Alzheimer's or try to diagnose him as a doctor would. What you do is you try to talk to the people that are close to him and see what you can find out. Not surprisingly, the White House officials tend to be pretty defensive of the president. But as Amie said, I think both of us did reporting on that decline dating back to our book, Lucky, and through the course of the last few years. I think even we were shocked at the level that we saw on the debate stage that one night. One last thing, the American people aren't dumb. They could see Biden's decline, even if it's not being reported as such, even if nobody's got a diagnosis for him. They could see that decline, and they could see that the White House was lying about it. And I think that is part of the reason that Joe Biden was so unpopular by the time he was out of the race. And I think it's one of the reasons that swing voters didn't trust the Democrats by the time Election Day rolled around in November.
The next phase shocked me. Trump went through getting shot, the iconic moment of standing up, yelling, "Fight, fight, fight," with blood coming down, going to a very successful convention, and everything is sort of set. You know that the Trump people know they can beat Biden. And I remember that Sunday morning after the convention, Biden just dropped out. I don't know how much George Clooney was responsible, but clearly between Speaker Pelosi and Barack Obama and others, there was a sudden surge to get him out of the race.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is there's basically a 24-day period there. And there are Democrats that are watching that debate that know that they need to get rid of Joe Biden. And one of them is Nancy Pelosi. But she also is very worried as she's talking to donors and friends and, members of Congress, even that night. She's very worried, according to one of our sources who spoke to her, that there will be a bum rush to get rid of Biden and that they will end up with Harris. And she does not think that Kamala Harris is a very good candidate. She also knows that the president can't be forced from the ticket, that it has to be his decision at some point. So she knows that there's going to be pushback from him if she pushes on him too hard, that he'll get his back up against the wall and it'll be counterproductive. So you see her over the course of 24 days try to manage a process to get him to a place where he will get out. Other people try to do that. They're not as strong. His donors freeze the money for their super PAC got frozen. And we go into all the sort of details of these machinations in the book. We could talk about it for about 9 hours and not detail all the stuff that's in the book. But I think the basic core is not just smart Democrats, but I would say most Democrats understood that Biden needed to leave. The question was when, how to get him to make that decision on his own and who would replace him. And two of the most powerful people in the party, Speaker Pelosi and President Obama, thought that the best idea was to have some sort of mini primary or open convention, a mini primary leading to an open convention, which in my humble opinion would have been a complete bloodbath for the Democrats that would have ended up with Kamala Harris as the nominee anyway.
It just struck me at the time that I don't know to what extent she was inevitable and to what extent Biden saying she should be my successor made it inevitable. You go from Joe Biden, the president, is the nominee, to Joe Biden has withdrawn, and she's virtually inevitable.
Yeah. What's fascinating about that moment is gathered in her pool house at the Naval Observatory in Washington are her very close aides and advisors, and they're all meeting not knowing that this announcement is coming in the coming hours. They're meeting to discuss what a switch might look like. And they all think it might happen later in the week, but they're surprised to learn when someone comes in and alerts them of the fact and she has to get on the phone with the president. It's quite startling to all of them. And then that leads to her kind of wanting, she knows that every minute counts and she really needs to get everyone behind her, including her boss, President Biden. And so she asks him on the call, she says, "Are you sure you're going to drop out?" And he says, "Yes." And she says, "Are you going to endorse me?" And he says, "You've got my support, kid," which obviously isn't a full endorsement. And she knows that. So she pushes even more and says, "Look, I need your endorsement." And so long story short, he talks with his advisors and they issue an endorsement, but he was going to do it later in the week. So all of this was happening, and she knows that she needs the support because there are other Democrats who are considering maybe jumping in the race, and they're worried about people like Governor Pritzker. She knew she had to pounce, and quickly.
Did you think he did that because he genuinely liked her, or he genuinely thought she was the natural follower of his presidency?
I think he did it for a whole lot of reasons, Mr. Speaker, and you would know this better than I would, but I think often when people make political decisions, they think about their gut, they make a list of pros and cons, and if everything lines up on the pro side, they do the thing. And I think in this case for him, there are a lot of things lining up on the pro side. The first of which was, if he had picked somebody else or not endorsed her, it would have looked like him admitting a mistake in having picked her to be the vice president in the first place. He tells the American people in 2020, this is the next best person to run the country should something happen to me. And if he turned around and didn't endorse her, I think it would have made him look bad in that original choice. I think because she's a black woman and because the Democratic Party's sort of mores are what they are, I think that he liked the idea that should she win, he would get some plaudits for having paved the way in that direction. And if he hadn't helped her, conversely, would have angered a lot of people in his own base. Just to touch on something Amie said a minute ago, what's just fascinating for anybody that loves politics, and we really flesh this out in the book, is this moment of Joe Biden's vanity, really, where he is saying to Kamala Harris on the phone, and by the way, they had 2 phone calls. It's only been reported before that they had 1, but in the book we have the second phone call too. He's got this moment of vanity where he's saying to her, I want you, but I want 3 or 4 days to just sort of bask in the glory of my own greatness at voluntarily giving up power like George Washington. And we all heard him say that, right? Like when he gave his speech to the nation, he compared himself to George Washington. And by the way, he compared himself to George Washington, to FDR, to LBJ throughout his presidency. And I think that we will all look back and say that he was none of those leaders. He was not Reagan, not Lincoln. But there's this moment of vanity, and he wants to be the center of attention still. And Kamala Harris is like, I got to whip these votes. I got to get all these people lined up. I got to do it before Gretchen Whitmer or Gavin Newsom or J.B. Pritzker gets out of the box. And I've got an advantage, but only if you endorse me quickly. And if you don't endorse me quickly, we all devolve. And she finally sort of makes that case, and he ends up doing 2 statements about 30 minutes apart. That's as close as she can get to getting him to endorse her in the first statement, is that he does a second one endorsing her. And to just put an exclamation point on why this mattered so much, we report that Jim Clyburn, the congressman from South Carolina, I know you know him well, Mr. Speaker. He was elected, I think, just before you became Speaker. Clyburn knows he has a phone call scheduled with Obama that afternoon, and he wants to be able to get out his own endorsement of Harris because he knows Obama is calling to get him to support an open convention. So even after the transfer, Obama's still trying to make that happen.
It does raise a question, sort of a what if. All the delegates had already been picked. So you had a finite universe. I mean, I do think the threat of the Black Caucus to have repudiated her would have, I think, irrevocably shattered the party for the foreseeable future. So in that sense, she was almost the inevitable nominee. But at the same time, you try to think about anybody else trying to enter at that point, even if Biden had not endorsed her, would have had an enormous uphill problem. I don't quite see how even somebody with Newsom's resources or Pritzker's resources, how they could have done it in the short time that was available.
I agree with you, Mr. Speaker, and I think that's one of the reasons none of them ended up trying, is that it takes enormous resources. She was able to inherit the Biden campaign treasury, which was a big thing that others would not have been able to do, or at least it would have been more complicated in terms of election law. So I agree with you. I think anybody else gets in, they have some sort of open convention, they destroy their party for many years in the fight that happens, and she ends up with it anyway.
We're at a point now, he has endorsed her. She is inevitable. I've often thought about the Trump people. They'd invested all this time and energy. They clearly thought they had Biden in a position where they're going to beat him. And all of a sudden that Sunday, their world changes. I mean, that had to be reasonably traumatic.
Yeah, I think it was very much traumatic, not least for President Trump. Something that's lost at times, I guess, is this sort of the degree to which his comeback is like the most epic comeback in American political history.
Maybe you could argue Andrew Jackson from after he lost in 24. This is the most extraordinary personal achievement of just grinding your way to power that I've ever seen.
And he beats Joe Biden. He knocks him clean out of the election. There's one more, for anybody that plays video games, it's like one more boss after you thought you won the video game that comes out.
When I talked to them during that period, they were actually pretty confident that they'd beat her. I think they were a little rattled about how to shift gears, and that took them about a week. But underneath that, they thought they would shift gears, that she was definable, they would be able to beat her, and they just had to grind it out.
So I agree with you. The people that we spoke to also felt confident, but I would say a little nervously confident, right? I mean, there's that underlying, we don't know exactly how long her sugar high is going to last.
And it was disorienting. I mean, you suddenly had all this new money coming in, all this new enthusiasm, and you had, of course, the propaganda media's all-out effort to build her up as though she was Joan of Arc reincarnated. Maybe it would have been a close race around Labor Day. There was sort of a peak moment of pretending that she was really competent. And then gradually it turned out that she lacked the cognitive excuse that Biden has, but she wasn't actually much better at answering questions than Biden was.
Arguably worse, right? I mean, this was a change election. The vast majority of Americans said the country was on the wrong track. Biden offered nothing in change. He's out. There's this opportunity for her to offer something that is change from what Biden's doing, and she lashes herself to him. And he tells her, as we report in the book for the first time, he says to her, no daylight, kid. don't distance yourself from me. There should be no daylight between us. And she's hearing this as she comes in, and, she owes him some loyalty. He put her in this position in the first place. And she doesn't have her own plan. And I think that becomes pretty apparent. And so as a result, the Democrats are offering nothing in the way of substantive change to the American people in what was clearly a change election. I mean, most elections are change elections, but I don't remember a right track, wrong track that looked like the right track, wrong track of this election cycle. It could not have been screaming more loudly at the Democrats.
The Jimmy Carter right track, wrong track in 80 was comparable, but not dramatically worse. She's raising this astonishing amount of money. It's hard to imagine you could raise that amount of money and not somehow figure out a strategy for defining Trump out of the race.
I know. And what's interesting is that she had outraised him and outspent him in the end. And even the metrics were all in her favor, too, and they kept pointing out to us that they had more boots on the ground. They had more people in the swing states. And what's interesting is it didn't matter because she wasn't really connecting. Her message wasn't resonating with voters. And they were all over the place in terms of message. And I think that's why you're seeing the Democratic Party right now kind of lost and not understanding what it is they stand for.
From that standpoint, I always felt that she was sort of caught in a trap, and that if she had tried to distance herself from Biden, Biden would probably have reacted very aggressively. And he did towards the end. I always thought towards the very end that he and Jill decided that it would be pretty cool to be the only person ever to beat Trump. But I just had this sense that there were 3 or 4 things he did towards the end that hurt her, and that they weren't because he was stupid and old. He just decided that she wasn't going to be president, and that he was pretty happy about that.
I don't think our reporting ever got to the level of here's exactly what Joe Biden was thinking as he sabotaged Kamala Harris. But to your point, you can literally point to 3 or 4 things that he did. By the way, the White House staff was telling the campaign staff, do whatever you have to do to win. And Biden, one-on-one with Harris, was telling her, don't distance yourself. So I think that's a number one sort of thing. And to your other point, there's an implicit threat in that. He's still the sitting president. He still has the bully pulpit, the platform. And if she distances herself, he has the ability to slam her for it, no matter how directly or subtly or whatnot. He has the ability to influence her future. And then, he puts on a MAGA hat at one of the rallies. My son still thinks that Joe Biden endorsed Donald Trump because he saw that video. He said, didn't Biden endorse Trump? And I'm like, no, Biden didn't endorse Trump. He makes that remark about, and I want to use quotation marks here, about Trump supporters being garbage, while she's giving her sort of her culmination speech, at the foot of the White House. So, yeah, he did some things that were.
I wrote at the time, if you hold a big party with 75,000 people directly in front of the White House, and you don't invite the president and first lady, they are likely to be very offended. What did I miss?
I think you're right, Mr. Speaker.
What was the Harris team thinking of?
I think they wanted to publicly distance themselves from him. They see the polls more than anyone. They knew how unpopular he was in that moment. And yet they couldn't quite do that because of what the president was telling Harris, which was, please, no daylight between us. And so they were walking a tightrope in how to handle that situation.
One of the interesting things you get into that was a little bit of a surprise, I think, was the emergence of J.D. Vance as vice president. Trump really weighed that for a pretty good length of time. It wasn't automatic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that process played out the way not every process that President Trump engages in plays out in a sort of traditional way, but I think this one kind of did, in that I think Vance was always the favorite, or at least had a lead over the others, and the president in the end got back to his guy, or the guy that was leading the pack. But he has this sort of beauty pageant, right? Or the Bachelorette or something, where he's bringing vice presidential hopefuls on stage with him, and he's praising them, and he's talking about their chances openly. It's entertainment, and it keeps the focus on Trump in that pick at times when it might otherwise have been on Harris. We write about the sort of last effort to lobby him on Trump Force One as he's flying to the Republican convention. I think in the end, Vance represented where the MAGA movement is going. I think he has his finger on the pulse of it better than anybody else. I think Trump knew that Vance would be loyal to him as vice president, and I think, or at least thought he would be. And as we write, Trump doesn't actually think vice president is the most important of his picks. He thinks Secretary of State and Attorney General are a little bit more important, but I think Vance represented enough of the things that he was looking for, and nobody else did.
I have to go back just for a second to Harris. Do you think if the campaign had lasted longer, she would have done better or worse?
She thinks that if the campaign went on longer, she would have won. And we report that in the book. She's told aides that she thinks the condensed timetable was not in her favor. But that's interesting because a lot of Democrats think that the shorter timetable did favor her. She came into it. She had the convention. She had the wind at her back. And then there was a period where she didn't do any media. And people had this sense that she was trying to run out the clock. And I think that hurt her, and the fact that she wasn't out there and let Trump sort of build the narrative around him at the time. And then there were these two ads, of course, in the final weeks of the campaign that I think were potent. And one of them was the trans ad, which I think was probably the best political ad in recent cycles. And then another ad, which talked about her appearance on The View, where she essentially said that there was nothing she would do that was different from the president. Both of those things hurt her in big ways.
I thought that was the death knell, frankly. They lobbed the softest ball they could lob. She could have picked anything and said, well, I'd probably do X differently. But instead she goes, oh, no, I can't think of a thing I do differently. Well, as you were pointing out, if this is a change election, that's unbelievably self-destructive on her part. If you want to understand the scale of Trump's genius and his capacity now to have started in 15 and still be there doing it, it was the combination of giving out French fries at McDonald's and then the garbage truck. If you're trying to appeal to middle America, 87% of the country goes to McDonald's at least once a year. 87%. 40 million Americans have worked at McDonald's, including Jeff Bezos. And then, of course, you have the whole symbology with the garbage truck and Trump walking into the convention hall wearing the garbage outfit and saying, people say it makes me look thinner. Maybe I should wear it the rest of the campaign. I mean, at that point, I don't care how much money she raises, the earned media value of those two events is incalculable, it seems to me.
Absolutely agree with you. I mean, Trump figured out in this election, and we detail some of it, figured out in this election how to reach voters who are not traditional voters and to basically create a cultural affinity with a lot of them. And it's more valuable than gold in politics to have somebody like you because they think you go to McDonald's with them, or you're willing to get in a garbage truck, or you get on one of the podcasts or one of the YouTube shows that they listen to, not for the politics, but because they like the comedian that's doing it, or they like the guests that show up there, and they suddenly start to think to themselves, well, Donald Trump's not a politician. He's a guy like me. He can sit down with Joe Rogan.
Can you imagine Kamala trying to do Joe Rogan for 3 hours?
No, it would have been a disaster. I mean, it was a disaster that they set up a rally for her in Houston on a Friday night in the fall where football is the only thing going on, so that she can be close to Joe Rogan's studio in case they work out a deal and it falls through. And it's not a swing state. There's no reason to be in Texas. And they bring in Beyonce, and Beyonce refuses to sing, so they don't even get that. Just total debacle. But what might have been a worse debacle would have been actually going on for 3 hours with Joe Rogan. As we saw in the 10 seconds on The View, she didn't have anything to say that would have differentiated her from Biden on anything substantive. The one thing she said in the one debate was different between the two of them was background and experience. And that's not what the public was looking for. It wasn't like, we want somebody with a different background running the country. That's the change we're looking for.
I was watching Trump at Ultimate Fighting Championship. He currently has a net 17 advantage among younger males in terms of approve, disapprove. 17, okay? Which for a Republican has probably not been true since Theodore Roosevelt. And what hit me watching him was, first of all, he obviously enjoys himself, but for an entire generation of younger males, they could identify with what he was doing in a way that nobody else in the country would. People at Harvard don't watch Ultimate Fighting Championships. but that there's a knack to what he does that is consistently marketing to niches nobody else thinks of and doing it in ways that are not political, but have a consequence that's very political. And I think that makes him very different from anybody we've ever seen.
It's second nature to him. It's the branding genius of Donald Trump. You know, you could put 10 Pepsi executives in a room and they wouldn't be half as good as Trump is at branding himself. And it feels so natural. I am certain that, like most people in politics, he spends some of his time in the shower or at night thinking, what's the catchphrase I want out there? But whenever it comes out, it just sounds like everything else. So to your point, I think he just kind of subliminally is branding all the time to various people.
Well, I think he sleeps 4 hours a day. And I think for all 20 hours, he's thinking about the next game, the next phrase. It's just an endless process on his part. Let me ask you two one last question. I really appreciate you taking this time, and I'm delighted that your publisher talked you into doing this book, which is pretty remarkable to have put it together literally in real time as things were actually happening. But what's the biggest single surprise to you looking at the whole experience?
I'll tell you, I think the biggest single surprise is the degree to which President Trump learns. At his age, most people aren't still actively learning. And you see, I think, between 2020 and 2024, a real understanding of what his limitations were in 2020, how he hurt himself in the 2020 election in different ways, and what he needed to do to keep this campaign on track, including, but not limited to, hiring Susie Wiles to run the show. I think she did a great job with that. I think his position on a national abortion ban, where he basically didn't endorse it, his staff came to him and said, look, a lot of these swing states have more liberal abortion laws, and if you do a national abortion ban, you're going to energize the folks that are for abortion rights. You're going to energize them against you. But if you don't support the thing, you take that issue off the table in those states. They convinced him to get behind early voting, which he obviously doesn't believe in. You know, he's going to try to get rid of that now, but they convinced him, in order to compete, you got to do this. So you go through this and you're like, here's a candidate who has truly evolved from 2020 in terms of focusing himself, disciplining himself on the campaign trail, listening to the right people, crowding out some of the wrong voices. To me, watching all of that happen and getting sort of an inside look, which I think you do in this book, it was surprising, because it's surprising any time a fully grown adult actually develops and learns. I mean, I'm almost 50, and it's hard for me to learn and change my ways.
There were so many, but I think the human aspect, we detail this scene in the book with Susie Wiles talking to a communications aide, Danielle Alvarez, in a kitchenette as the Trump criminal trial is happening in New York. And it's a very human moment, because she tears up, she chokes up and says, I have a feeling if they're not going to get him this way, they're going to try to kill him. And I think that's a really, really powerful moment. And it shows just how much all of these people went through in the last cycle, at least. And so I think that is one big revelation. But also, when you look at the train wreck on the Democratic side, you see that Kamala Harris enters election night thinking that she's going to win. And I think that was one of the biggest bombshells in the book, too, because, you know, she is gaslit by her own campaign. So I think you learn something new on every page of this book, but there are so many key moments that explain so much.
Listen, I want to thank both of you for joining me. I think the speed with which you did this book, the number of unique insights you have in it, Fight Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House, really is a wild book about a wild battle. It's available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. It's a great read. I recommend everybody who wants to understand American politics and government ought to get a copy of it. And we're certainly going to link to it on our show page. But I want to thank the two of you, given everything you're doing and your status as, once again, best-selling authors. I really appreciate you taking time with us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you to my guests, Jonathan Allen and Amie Parnes. You can get a link to buy their new book, Fight Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.